Seeing as how it's Halloween, I decided to rewatch the old monster movie House of Dracula, and now I'm making a video to share my thoughts. I actually have a lot of thoughts on this. I'm planning on rambling on for a long time, I think. But let me give you maybe some quick links down below in case you don't want to stay for all the rambling. I watched a copy of this off of YouTube. I'm not sure how long the copy will stay up there because it's copyrighted material. So sooner or later, it will probably be taken down by the copyright patrol. But the copy I watched was uploaded in 2016. So it's 2021 now. It's made it 5 years so far. So maybe it'll make it another year or 2 years or 3 years. I don't know. Check the link in the description down below. If it's still up, you can watch it. If it's been taken down, you'll have to look somewhere else. Also, I'm gonna do my usual bit where I just ramble on and on, but there are a couple more succinct reviews of this. That actually have are properly edited and have video clips of the movie to illustrate the points that they make. So I'll try and link to them down in the description down below so that you can watch a more professional, coherent review of this. The Cinemassacre did a good review of this a few years ago for their Halloween Monster Madness. Unfortunately, it's a little bit hard to find their review now. The review I found was uploaded by a channel that was not Cinemassacre. That was just like a Cinemassacre tribute channel. But whatever, I'll link to it in the description down below, or you can search around and find it yourself. Okay, that out of the way. This is one of those classic Universal monster movies from 1945. This was actually the last of the monster movies, at least the Dracula, Frankenstein, Wolfman ones. Kind of, it depends on whether or not you count Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, which most people kind of count because it had a lot of the original actors or the classic actors. But if you don't count that one, then this is the last one of the period, which goes from 1930 to 1945. The Dracula, Frankenstein, Wolfman movies, and I was obsessed with these movies when I was young, around, I don't know, 10, 11, 12, right around 5th grade, 6th grade, 7th grade, that age. Which I was very, yeah, let me back up here a moment. It's interesting. You'll have to bear with me. I'm going to go on a few of these digressions, but I find it really interesting how kids that age are just so fascinated with horror. And I notice it now because I'm a teacher myself. I've been teaching English as a second language. I've taught in Japan and Cambodia and Vietnam. And all those countries, I've taught kids who are that age, 5th grade, 6th grade, 7th grade, 10, 11, 12, 13. And they are just fascinated by horror movies, or just fascinated by scary stories or horror in general, which I was at that age as well, and which most of us are, right? If you think back to when you were that age, it's interesting to me, maybe from like a evolutionary psychology standpoint, which is admittedly something I don't really know much about, so I'm just speculating as an ignoramus here. But what is it about horror that so fascinates humans? I mean, you could take a step back and say, what is it about stories? Why do we humans love narratives? Why do we love telling stories? Why do we love reading stories or watching movies? I mean, that in and of itself is a fascinating question. But then why are certain genres popular? Why is action popular? Why is romance popular? And why is horror so popular, and why particularly is it popular with that age? Why is it something that for a few years, when we're 10, 11, 12, 13, just fascinates us so much, and then I think most of us lose interest in it gradually. When you're in high school, it still has some attraction. When you're in college, sometimes you still like to watch scary movies, but when a lot of people grow out of it. I say a lot because actually I'm aware, being on BookTube here, that there is a community of HorrorTube that includes adults of all ages, and every now and again I enjoy reading a horror story myself. But I think by and large it is something that fascinates people around the junior high school era. So yeah, I'm just going to throw that question out there. If anybody knows, you can write in the comments down below if you have any ideas. One idea that does strike me is that when I was younger, I had an idea when I was watching a movie. I had an idea of it being a genuine universe on its own terms. Like I knew it wasn't real. I knew it was all fantasy, but I had this idea that it was real on its own terms, if that makes sense. So like these were real characters with real motivations, and if one of them, if something bad were to happen to them, or if one of them would to die, it would be like almost like a real person dying. Be, be, even though it wasn't real, it just seemed like it was real on its own terms. Whereas nowadays, now that I'm older, when I watch a movie, I think, oh, okay, well, that's just a standard story arc. This is so predictable. The writers are getting lazy. I can see they're cutting corners on the budget. I find it much. I don't get as immersed in the movies as I did when I was younger. I don't buy into them as a world in their own terms, if that makes sense. So that's at least maybe one reason why horror movies lose some of their power. But anyways, so when I was right around that age where people get fascinated by scary movies, I was fascinated by these older scary movies. I grew up in the 80s and 90s, so these movies were well before my time. But I was still fascinated with them, partly because I've always been fascinated by old retro stuff, and partly because this old retro stuff. It was fascinating because it was stuff that you heard about a lot. The images of Dracula, Frankenstein, and the Mummy and everything were everywhere. They were on breakfast box cereals and everything. But the actual movies weren't as available, and perhaps especially in my context, because I grew up in a conservative Christian home where we weren't allowed to watch this stuff. So for a few years, around 5th grade and 6th grade, I spent a lot of time actually reading about this stuff, even though I wasn't allowed to watch it. So reading Dracula and Frankenstein, not the originals, but simplified versions for younger readers. Reading about all the monster movies. There was a book in our school library about classic monster movies, and I read that book, and I read a couple books about classic monster movies, and then when we got internet hooked up at our place, the internet in the early 90s was in its infancy then. There wasn't Google, there wasn't Wikipedia, but there were private subscription services. Prodigy was I think the popular one. That's the one we had, and they did have a database of movie reviews or movie descriptions that you could search through. I don't think there was any hyperlinks. So like I think the way I found about all the monster movies was just searching for the names individually. So, like, I searched for all the movies with the word Frankenstein in its title. I searched for all the movies with the word Dracula in the title. And in that way, I was able to build up my knowledge of what the different movies were and what the plots of each of those movies were. Um, and yeah, I was just fascinated by the idea of them for a few years before my parents actually let me watch any of them. Um, and time goes slower when you're a kid, so it was probably only like a couple of years, but it seemed like an eternity of wanting to watch these movies, and I would imagine how scary they must be, and think to myself, uh, would I be brave enough to watch these movies, etc. I was also fascinated just by the atmosphere of the movies, even though I hadn't seen them yet. You're aware of them through parody or popular culture. The moon shadowed by clouds, the graveyard, the spooky castle, all these elements, the fog at night, which just fascinated me, and I really dug the atmosphere of what I perceived as those old Universal movies. So yeah, eventually, I mean, cable came into prominence during the late '80s or '90s, or at the very least, we got it in our house around that time. And there was AMC, American Movie Classics, which I think they've changed their format, but when I was a kid, they used to just rerun movies from the golden age of Hollywood, like the 30s, 40s, or 50s. And they would occasionally run some of these classic monster movies, and especially in the month of October. And again, this was before the internet, or before the internet was really as we know it today. So we would get the paper every Sunday, which would have all the program listings for the week and all the movies that were going to be shown. And I would go through all the movies that were going to be shown that week on TV and just look up, okay, are there any Frankenstein movies on TV this week? Are there any Dracula movies on TV this week? Because they would be on cable sometimes, but not often. So you really had to keep a sharp eye out for it. And when I eventually finally got around to seeing them, I forget what I first saw. Maybe Dracula or Frankenstein was some of the movies I first saw. I was disappointed that they weren't scary. Which is, yeah, something everyone discovers when they get around to seeing these old movies from the 30s and 40s, the old horror movies. They're actually not scary. Um, Now, it's an interesting question how scary they were to the people at the time. I think they were moderately scary to the people at the time. For a long time, I believed that they were really scary for the people at the time. But I don't know how much of that is actually true. I mean, there's this urban legend that theaters had to put a warning in front of the Frankenstein movie, warning the audiences that it was a scary movie, and if they were too scared, then that was going to be on them, because they got so many complaints about from people who weren't able to sleep after seeing the movie. Um, but then I heard I heard later that that was somewhat just a marketing campaign by the movies. I don't know. They were at least somewhat scary to the people at the time, at least initially. I think. I don't know. Let me know what your impression of it is in the comments down below. I also think, while I'm on this tangent, how long did they stay scary? I think the general impression I get is that the movies from the 30s and 40s were still popular through the 50s and 60s. Um, and I think that like nowadays when you watch those old movies, they just seem so dated, and the special effects are so dated, and the pacing and the acting and the whole style of everything is so completely different. But I think that break maybe didn't happen till like the 70s or something. I think throughout the 50s and at least the early 60s, there wasn't like that huge generation gap or stylistic gap. And I think those old monster movies stayed current throughout that generation. They were definitely still in the air when I was a kid. Lots of pop culture references to them, and books in the library about classic Hollywood monsters and stuff like that. I'm completely out of touch now because I've been living abroad for so long. How much cultural relevance do those old Universal monster movies have with young kids today? Any awareness at all? Do they know they exist? Or let me know in the comments. Anyways, eventually, when I was watching these movies off of cable TV, I actually had a list. I would make a list of all the ones I saw, and I wanted to see them all. And I saw almost all of them. Actually, House of Dracula was the one I never got around to seeing when I was a kid, just because it was never on TV. I saw almost everything else except House of Dracula. Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, I don't think I saw that until I was in high school. But I did catch that on cable when I was in high school. The Ghost of Frankenstein, I don't think I've seen. I think that's the one movie in this series I never got around to seeing. Other than that, I saw the Dracula movies. There was only one Wolfman movie. I think there were 4 Frankenstein movies. The last one being Ghost of Frankenstein, which I think is the one I didn't see. And then there were the team-up movies. Now, there's actually... I was under the impression when I was a kid that there were, like, tons of these team-up movies. But there's actually only a handful of them. There's Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, House of Frankenstein, and then House of Dracula. So just 3 official ones, and then, if you count Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, kind of a 4th one. But really just 3 official ones. So Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman and House of Frankenstein I saw when I was in junior high school. House of Frankenstein was just never on TV, so I didn't get around to seeing that until I was in college. When I was at the video rental store one summer while I was in college, and just scanning the shelves as you do, and not finding anything I was interested in, so just kind of going deeper and deeper in. And then finding House of Dracula and being like, House of Dracula. That's the one I never got around to seeing as a kid. And I knew, well, I knew it was a team-up movie. I knew it had Dracula, Frankenstein, and the Wolfman in it. So I rented it from the video store when I was in college and watched it. I think if memory serves, it was a summer night, and my sister, who was a couple years below me in college, had a bunch of her friends over, and they were all in the basement. And I came home and I tried to put my movie on, and I was kind of watching it while they were around it, and they found it rather strange. Like, why in the world would anyone watch this? And I said, well, I've always wanted to see this. This is one monster movie I never saw when I was a kid. And I remember being a little bit bored when I watched it. But being glad I finally got around to watching it. So I've decided to rewatch it because it's Halloween. Every now and again, I like to try and get into the Halloween spirit by rewatching some of these classic monster movies. Since I've actually started doing my movie reviews on this YouTube channel, I haven't rewatched any of those monster movies. Although when I lived in Japan, I used to rent some of them for Halloween. I'm living in Vietnam now, so there's no video rental stores around here, and it's very hard to legally obtain any of these movies. But I thought I wonder if they're on YouTube. And I was searching around, and House of Dracula was not the first one I searched for, because it's not the best of the movies, and it's not the one I've got the most nostalgic value for. I think House of Frankenstein was the one I searched for first, because that one I actually did see back when I was in sixth grade, and that one actually does hold more nostalgic value for me, and I think is maybe a better movie, although I'd need to rewatch it. But after failing to find that, House of Dracula I did find on YouTube, so I thought, I'll just watch this for Halloween, and then make a commentary on it. So here I am, 20 minutes into the video, and I haven't even gotten around to talking about the actual movie. So I said I was going to ramble, and I'm a rambling. But yeah, let's talk about the movie. So House of Frankenstein was the previous movie. Well, let's back up. There was a Dracula franchise. Now, the Dracula franchise only had one movie with Dracula in it, and that was Dracula. The other movies are Dracula's Daughter and Son of Dracula, which are, as the titles would suggest, about his daughter and son. But Dracula was dead in the first movie. He doesn't come back. Frankenstein was in 4 movies, like I said. And the Wolfman was only in 1 movie. On his own. Then they had Frankenstein meets the Wolfman, which ended with them getting, it ended with them fighting and then them getting covered in a flood, and the water just washing them away. Then House of Frankenstein was the first movie to try and incorporate Frankenstein, Dracula, and the Wolfman, but they didn't. Yeah, it's a theme throughout all these team up movies, all of them, that the screenwriters don't quite know what to do with these monsters. So I mean, Frankenstein meets the Wolfman, the first movie in the series. It sounds really cool. I mean, what 12-year-old boy wouldn't want to see 2 hours of Frankenstein and the Wolfman fighting? Except the screenwriters didn't know how to write a movie that was just 2 hours of Frankenstein and the Wolfman fighting. So it's just only at the very end do both monsters come alive in the same room and fight each other, and they fight each other for like 5 minutes at the very end or something. Keep in mind, all of these movies I haven't seen for years. So I'm going off of old memories here. Correct me if I get anything wrong. Then House of Frankenstein starts off. It picks up where Frankenstein meets the Wolfman left off, where they find Frankenstein and the Wolfman trapped in ice from the events of the previous movie. And Dracula is in it as well. This is the first movie that had all 3 monsters, but Dracula was only in the first act, and he actually died before Frankenstein and the Wolfman come into the movie. So all 3 are in it, but they're not really connected. Then comes House of Dracula, which was 1945, just 1 year after House of Frankenstein. And this is yet another movie where the screenwriters are trying to figure out a way to shoehorn all 3 monsters in here, but they're not really able to do it very effectively. So unfortunately, you don't really get a scene where the 3 monsters are fighting each other. Let me back up maybe a moment and talk about the actors. So Bela Lugosi, who's infamous for Dracula, actually was only Dracula in that first movie. And then he came back for Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, which, even though it's called Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, it had all 3 of the monsters in it. But I mean, aside from the Abbott and Costello one, he was only ever in Dracula, and then he didn't come back for the other he didn't reprise the role again for Universal. I don't know why. I was just looking at Wikipedia and something about being under contract to another studio or something. Um, so in House of Frankenstein, Dracula is played by what's the guy's name? John Carradine, I believe is the name of the actor. Um, Boris Karloff, of course, was infamous for Frankenstein, but I think Boris Karloff just hated that makeup. So he played Frankenstein in the original Frankenstein, and then he played it in Bride of Frankenstein, and then I don't think he ever came back as Frankenstein. He was actually in House of Frankenstein, but he wasn't playing Frank the monster. He was playing. Sorry, I'm doing that classic thing, aren't I? Where I'm mixing up Doctor Frankenstein with Frankenstein's monster. No, apologies. So he was in House of Frankenstein, but he didn't play the monster. I forget who he played. So yeah, they had Glenn Strange who played Frankenstein's monster in a number of movies, and he is now in. He was in House of Frankenstein, and he's in House of Dracula. Lon Chaney Jr. Was always the Wolfman in all the Universal Wolfman movies, and so he's the Wolfman here again. Okay, so the movie. The movie opens with Dracula coming to visit this doctor, and this doctor is apparently very famous for being able to, I don't know, a famous doctor, and he indicates that he wants to be cured of his vampireness. He doesn't want to rely on drinking the blood of people anymore. I was reading, I think, on Wikipedia. They said it's like Dracula drinking blood has become a metaphor for a drug addiction that Dracula is trying to kick, which is different. In the earlier movies, the vampire thing was like a sexual metaphor. Now it seems to be like a drug metaphor where Dracula is trying to kick this drug addiction. The doctor is skeptical. He doesn't at first. He doesn't seem to really believe in Dracula, but then Dracula shows him his casket, and somehow Dracula's casket is in this castle. This movie does a good job of assembling a lot of the cliches that you expect from a movie like this. So there's a castle, there's kind of a mad scientist, there's a hunchback, there's a graveyard scene, and there's an old type of European town, and a lot of the cliches that are often in these movies. I think House of Frankenstein maybe does a little bit better job of assembling a lot of those cliches, but again, I'd have to rewatch that movie. So Dracula wants to be cured of his vampireness, and yeah, somehow Dracula's now got his casket in the guy's castle. By this is a doctor who's living in a castle. It's not really explained how he's in the castle. It's also not really explained how Dracula comes back to life, because he died in House of Frankenstein. Of course, he died at the end of the original Dracula as well. So yeah. I kind of figure with these monster movies, you can't expect too much adherence to logical continuity. Sometimes they make an effort to explain why the monster's back, and sometimes they don't. And then Lon Chaney Jr. shows up as Lawrence Talbot, the Wolfman. Now, this is another character who died in the end of House of Frankenstein, but it is back now again with no explanation. Yeah, Lon Chaney Jr. I think does a really good job with this character, Lawrence Talbot, I think is his name, if I'm pronouncing that right. Uh, I really liked his acting when I was a kid, uh, when I when I was an adolescent. Um, and I think it still basically holds up. I mean, he's, you know, Dracula is Dracula and Frankenstein is Frankenstein, but the Wolfman's got a split personality. Of course, he's kind of like the Incredible Hulk in a way. He doesn't want to become the Wolfman, so he's got a lot of angst with him, where he's always trying to get a cure, always trying to figure out a way to not turn into the Wolfman. But then, of course, he always does turn into a Wolfman when the moon comes out. So he comes to the doctor trying to get a cure. So now both the Dracula character and the Wolfman character are in the movie. Um, but we don't get to see the Wolfman transform a lot in this movie. So we get a lot of scenes of Lawrence Talbot, Lon Chaney Jr. playing Lawrence Talbot, I think is the name. But we don't get a lot of scenes of the Wolfman. Apparently, that's because they needed to save money. They didn't have as much yak hair around, which is as good a time as any to mention that the production values on this are low. So I was watching the movie, and I was thinking to myself, boy, this seems like it's really cheaply made. But like, it's been so long since I've watched old movies. You know, like I used to watch them all the time when I was a kid, but nowadays it's been so long since I've watched a movie from the 30s or 40s that I wasn't quite sure what was standard, what was a standard production value. Maybe they all look cheap. But then I was looking this up on Wikipedia after watching it, and sure enough, the production value on this was low. It was, 1945. It was right during the war or right after the war. So there was a materials shortage. They were also deliberately trying to do this on the cheap because they were doing all their movies on the cheap at that time. Apparently, the studio movies at the time were just churning stuff out like it was TV. It is the comparison, apparently, that people who were working for these studios at the time said. Just like TV has to get an episode out every week, these studios were just trying to churn stuff out very quickly on a very small budget with reused props, and it does have that feel of being cheap. Um, the music is apparently recycled from some of the other movies, which I don't mind because the music cues still are able to sting where they're needed to sting. Apparently, the footage of Frankenstein's monster in the fire at the end of this movie is recycled footage from the Ghost of Frankenstein, which I didn't realize. Of course, Ghost of Frankenstein is the one movie I never saw. Anyways, where was I? Oh yeah, so you've got the Wolfman there, and then they find Frankenstein's monster in the mud. Now this is like the one detail that lines up with House of Frankenstein, the previous movie, because in House of Frankenstein, the monster sinks into quicksand, and he sinks into quicksand while he's holding the mad scientist with him. So then they find him, and the monster's still alive because like nothing can kill the monster. But the mad scientist that he was holding when he sank into the quicksand is now just a skeleton. And they say it's what was the name? Dr. Namor's skeleton or something like that. Whatever the name of that mad scientist was from House of Frankenstein, they recognize it. Apparently, several years have gone by since House of Frankenstein, even though this was released just the next year afterwards. Now, Dracula either never wanted to be cured of his... never seriously wanted to be cured, or he changed his mind. It's a little bit unclear from the movie. Cinemassacre's video, I think, makes the case that Dracula was deceitful all along. because the very beginning of the movie, you see Dracula looking in at the window of the beautiful assistant of the doctor. And then once he's identified his victim, then he goes to the doctor and says, "Oh, I want to be cured." And that makes sense. It's not entirely clear though, so it could be that Dracula wants to be cured, and then changes his mind when he just what's the word for it? Can't resist making this beautiful woman his victim. But either way, oh, and this is the same actor from House of Frankenstein playing Dracula. I forgot if I mentioned that before. Either way, he is in the process of seducing this woman, and I she's got the cross around his neck or her neck, so that's stopping him momentarily. But then, excuse me, he gets her under his trance, so she throws the cross off. But then the doctor realizes what's happening. And so he says, "Okay, Dracula, we're going to do one last blood transfusion." And I don't know what his plan was. Maybe by giving Dracula more blood. I don't know. He's been giving Dracula blood transfusions all along in the hopes of finding a cure. Maybe he just wanted to speed up the cure, or maybe it was just an excuse to get Dracula away. But when Dracula is down there, he uses his hypnotic powers to put both the doctor and his hunchback assistant, because there's always a hunchback in these movies, into a trance. And then he gets up, and then he as he's leaving, he does something which the motivation for it is not clear, other than the fact that Dracula is just evil and he loves to do evil things. He reverses the blood flow. So instead of the blood transfusion from the doctor into Dracula, it just gets reversed. So now Dracula's blood is going into the doctor, which makes him into some kind of monster, although it's not clear what. He doesn't fully become a vampire. He becomes kind of like a Jekyll and Hyde type creature with some vampire elements of it. So then Dracula is going back to this woman, but then finally everyone snaps out of Dracula's trance, and they run, and they come in with the cross to save the woman from Dracula, and that includes Lon Chaney Jr. or sorry, his character is Lawrence Talbot. So that's like the one case of like the Wolfman and Dracula actually interacting. Although he's not the Wolfman, he's the Wolfman's alter ego, Lawrence Talbot. But he does run in with the rest of them to protect this woman. And by the way, this woman and Lawrence Talbot, this woman seems to have fallen in love with Lawrence Talbot. So they've got this romantic thing going on. This is maybe a good time to mention that both of the women in this movie are dated portrayals. It's kind of like the thing from the old movies where the women get flustered easily and can't control their emotions and don't know what to do in crises and stuff like that. Anyways, so Dracula is beaten off, chased off by the cross, and then as dawn comes up, he goes back into his coffin, which is in the same castle. But then they just go down there and open his coffin up and push him into the sunlight, push the coffin into the sunlight. And then that's the end of Dracula. The sun kills him, which is also how he died in the previous movie, House of Frankenstein. Lawrence Talbot is cured of werewolfism by these magic mushroom spores. The doctor apparently is able to diagnose there's actually a physical reason for him turning into a werewolf. I mean, I guess the thing you have to accept in this movie is, yes, it's a supernatural thing that he turns into a werewolf. But apparently, combined with the werewolf curse, there's some sort of physical manifestation of this curse, which is pressure in the brain during the full moon. So the doctor's been developing these mushroom spores, which apparently will can make the bone tissue soft, and he's been planning on using it to cure the hunchback. Now the hunchback, the hunchback, I guess by this point had become a stock character in the Universal monster movies, uh, possibly starting with the first Frankenstein monster movie, sorry, the first Frankenstein movie. I'm not sure, but yeah, in House of Frankenstein, there was a hunchback there, and usually these hunchbacks are bad characters or deranged characters. But this movie is including the hunchback, but playing on the trope a little bit, because it's actually a woman who's a hunchback, and it's a beautiful woman who's a hunchback. I mean, other than the fact that she's hunchbacked, her face is quite beautiful, and a very sweet person who just has this very sweet and kind person who just has this one deformity that needs to be cured. Um, yeah, so the plan is to use the mushroom spores to cure her as well. Uh, so that they do the operation on Lawrence Talbot, but it's not really an operation. They don't need to cut him up. It's just applying the mushroom spores to his head, and it cures him. So his after all these movies of being in agony and all this angst because he was the werewolf, uh, Lawrence Talbot's character arc finally comes to a happy end. He finishes out these series of movies cured of his wolfism and with a girl now and in love with this woman. That's assuming, of course, you don't count Abbott and Costello, in which he again appears as a werewolf. Um, Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein, but I don't think that one strictly counts in continuity, even though it's often regarded as part of the series. But yeah, so with Lawrence Talbot cured of his disease, of his werewolfism, and Frankenstein's monster has been spending the whole movie just asleep on the operating table because he hasn't been revived yet. He's been found, but he hasn't been revived. Then actually the doctor becomes the main monster of the movie, who's been infused with Dracula's blood. So he goes into the village, and there is actually a really decently creepy scene of him threatening the guy who's driving the coach. What do you call it? The horse and cart. It's a little bit unclear which time frame these movies take place in. I think they seem to be before the age of automobiles, so this is all taking place in the 19th century, I guess, or obviously it's some sort of fantasy land, some sort of Victorian-esque European fantasy land. So then the villagers come and come in to storm the castle, and then Frankenstein's monster gets revived right at the end of it. But then it's just right at the tail end, and then I guess Lawrence Talbot, aka the Wolfman, well, only he's not the Wolfman anymore, knocks some shelves over on Frankenstein's monster and starts a fire, and then he just burns in the fire, which is apparently recycled footage from the Ghost of Frankenstein. The sweet hunchback, unfortunately, comes to an unfortunate end. She gets strangled by the doctor in that last scene as she's trying to stop him from reviving Frankenstein. It's for a horror movie, it's a movie that has a very low body count. Um, so she is one of the victims. It's a scene that potentially could be horrifying, um, except it's done in such an offhand way. Like he just quickly strangles her and throws her aside, and then it's onto the villagers swarming into the castle. Um, yeah, so it's a scene that could potentially be horrific or scary if they had tried to put any gravity behind it. Um, there was something on Wikipedia about how the script of the film had to keep getting edited to surpass the censors. Um, I'm not exactly sure what all that means, but I guess there's some indication that there was some sort of system in place that was censoring these movies, um, and that they weren't. They were a little bit hamstrung. It sounds like they weren't as allowed to be as scary as they wanted to be. Um, yeah, speaking of Wikipedia, Wikipedia in its reception column for this movie quotes a few reviews from the time that indicated people at the time didn't think it was particularly scary either. Because that's always a question when you watch these movies. You're like, okay, well, it's not very scary now. Was it very scary at the time? And apparently it wasn't. Apparently not, according to some of those things from the Wikipedia article. Um, I don't know. Yeah, I think by this stage they were largely weren't trying to be scary. I think at this stage it was just the monster mashup and everything done in a budget and cranking out really quickly. Um, I think the early Wolfman and Frankenstein and Dracula movies, like the original of each one, the 1930s Frankenstein or the 1930s Dracula, I think those were supposed to be scary for the time, but I think these later mashups weren't supposed to be scary, or they weren't really putting that much effort into being scary, and I don't think people were particularly scared. Um, Although there's a couple deaths. The death of the stagecoach driver, when the stagecoach driver is talking to the mad doctor, and he's trying to get the horses to go faster, and the doctor's like, "What's the matter? Are you scared? Why are you scared of me?" That is a potentially creepy scene. Um, the part at the end where that sweet hunchback woman is being strangled could have had the potential to be scary if they had tried to make it scary. But they didn't. It was something that was just done very quickly. Um, there was some tension around Dracula attempting to seduce that woman. It got a little bit creepy. I don't know if it would call it scary, maybe a little bit, maybe of a thrilling scene. Like, will they get to her in time before Dracula does? But largely, I think this movie isn't scary and it wasn't supposed to be scary. It's somewhat atmospheric. So you've got the castle, you've got the full moon, but it's not. It's not as atmospheric as it could be. I think that's because it was on a very cheap budget. It would be interesting to go and back and rewatch like the original Wolfman, which I think the original Wolfman came out later than the original Frankenstein, right? 1940 or something. Um, I think maybe the movies with more of a budget did better on the atmosphere. According to Wikipedia as well, Wikipedia said that because everyone was getting back from the war in 1945, they didn't want to traumatize the audience. So they didn't want a lot of death and injuries. And apparently there was a scene where somebody had an injured limb that ended up getting cut because they were worried about too many soldiers coming back from the war with injured limbs, and they didn't want to remind people of that. Which actually is another interesting point, considering how sanitized these older movies were, and that strict code and everything for the movies in the 1940s. When you compare that with how violent the real world was uh, back then, it's it's interesting that 1930s and 40s were such a violent time in human history, and had such tame movies. Whereas nowadays, I think, I don't know, that there's always plenty of violence and wars and stuff like that going around. But I, I think I'm hesitating to make this sentence because as it's forming on my lips, I'm thinking of all the exceptions to what I'm about to say. But I think nowadays life is less violent than it was in the 30s and 40s, um, and the media is way more violent. So it's an interesting little thing that's flipped. Uh, yeah, I've rambled on for a long time here. I think the movie is a short little movie. It's only just slightly over an hour. I've been talking here for almost an hour, so um, I hope I've not wasted anyone's time with this rambling. Again, the movie's down in the description down below. Smart thing to do would be to just watch the movie instead of listening to me ramble. Do I have anything else I want to say about this? You know what? I probably could think of more things to say, but why bother? I've rambled on for long enough. Let's stop it here.